Excited and proud to host David Houston. David is the Chief Curator and Co-Director of the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. David is originally a native of South Carolina, and he was a faculty member at the School of Architecture at Clemson University. David taught the history of art in the 19th and 20th centuries. He has organized and curated over 100 exhibitions. He has also authored or edited over 20 publications. And tonight he will be presenting his ideas and leading a discussion about the changing role of museums and institutions of the like in our contemporary society. I know David to be possess wisdom from the inside, and also to execute candor from the outside, so tonight should be interesting and revelatory nonetheless.
For the hook! For the hook!
Sit down.
Oh, great God is... Oh, great God! Okay.
I needed to get paid before we got to that point.
Woo! You're off to a great start. I got my buddy with me.
Y'all need a drink or something, you two?
Yes, we do.
Anyway, the whole issue of museums and contemporary culture is one that's really blossomed in the last while. The last 15 to 20 years has really seen proliferations of museums of every type. And the museum is not an institution that has been with us for a long time. It's basically an invention of the 18th century. Some of the earliest ones started out as collections, and if you look at the oldest European museum, it's really the Vatican collection, who during the Renaissance started collecting classical artworks. The power, the money of the Catholic Church, and the idea of rebuilding Rome, of the Renaissance as the glories of ancient Rome, really caused people to start collecting art. And most culture was contemporary. It's hard to think that people didn't really reflect on the past very much in the way we do until the end of the 19th or the beginning of the 20th century, but indeed that's the case. So there are kind of two things that I think I'll say a few words about before I talk about museums a little bit, and that is the idea of history and the idea of information. I think most of us here, if we went around the room, would say that there are institutions we admire and there are institutions we dislike, but by and large many of us are probably skeptical of institutions and the role that they play in society. That's not to sound like someone from the Tea Party, but it's just to point out that institutions are connected to ideology, power, and all of those networks of things that are hidden forces that reveal themselves in institutions from small to large, whether universities, museums, or otherwise. So I think it's healthy that if people working in these institutions are also slightly skeptical and critical of them at the moment that they're making decisions, because a certain self-reflectiveness and a certain self-consciousness about what you're doing forces you to challenge accepted practices and forces you to look around and say, what does it mean what you're doing in the world right now? And how does it relate to, and how does it differ to people before you? So the first museums were private, and it was really the French Revolution that created the first public museum in the world, which was the Louvre. And the idea of equality and fraternity, the collections that had been royal and private were suddenly open to the people, open to anyone for the first time during the French Revolution. And it was the 18th century that saw the consolidation and the creation of a lot of the great European museums like the British Museum, the Louvre, and those collections that have a tremendous breadth and a tremendous depth. The United States was just moving out from under becoming a colony. So the idea of art and culture as we discuss it simply wasn't a major issue, because art and culture was basically a plaything for the rich and symbolic of the powerful and the important. It was really certain cities like Florence in the Renaissance that developed a certain egalitarian idea of a public art. If you look at many of the great sculptures of Donatello, of Michelangelo's David, they were placed in public places for the use of the people of the city. From the 18th century into the 20th century, we see this drive to create museums, and many of them come out of the colonial experience. The notion of going out into the world and great Europeans looting things, bringing the spoils of the colonial experience back home, and creating museums that were comprehensive, that were universal, about artifacts created across the world. Some of them were considered artifacts, others considered more anthropological curiosities. The Museum of Man in Paris was created as an anthropological museum of exotic other cultures, and became an important resource for many artists in the modernist period, like Picasso and Matisse, who were discovering African art and kind of adapting it on their own terms, taking from it what they thought were the terms of the context of African art, which were really the context of Europeans looking at African art. So if you look at the history of museums as they evolve through time, first of all, they're private, they become public, and then they open out to the world in a more kind of larger global experience. And one of the things about art museums is, if you look at their evolution, they're opening themselves to different people, different types of art, and really lately to the world. So the franchise of art, which was very, very closely controlled literally until the revolution of the late 60s and the 70s, in the past 25 or 30 years has expanded exponentially. What was once seen as marginal or art on the fringes, in fact, my friend Gino Rodriguez, that created the Alternative Museum in the 1970s, had this major problem, because by the 1990s, the artists that were alternative, like a David Hammonds or an Adrian Piper, and a lot of people that he gave their first museum exhibitions to, were being celebrated and embraced by the Met and the Museum of Modern Art. And he simply didn't have another act in him to try to find something that was the margins. But by that time, what we used to call the margins was so much a part of the art system, whether they're self-taught artists or artists of color, artists of political and social protest, that they were part of the mainstream art world. So there's a really changing dynamic through history, and in this, the museum kind of sits in a central location, because if you think of art as a kind of an ecology or an ecological system, each institution within that has different functions. There's the gallery, which is kind of the front line of the first sifting of artwork, where artists bring their work to the market, bring their work to the fore, and in doing so, there's a real openness, because there's no accounting for taste, and there's an audience for almost anything that an artist makes. If you don't believe me, go to the French Quarter. I think that's a clear demonstration that people, that those of us kind of encoded in the contemporary art world, look at that art and say, A, how do they stay in business, and B, who pays money for it? And so the range of things that we call contemporary culture finds the museum today kind of in a completely different situation. Because first of all, museums usually were focused on the past. The idea that a good artist was a dead artist was a very typical one for a museum up until the mid part of the 20th century.